In the quiet plains of post-war Kansas, where wind howled through broken barns and unmarked graves, a child began to speak of murders she could not have known. Each night she whispered names, real names, of the dead. By spring, the townsfolk stopped asking who she was and began asking what. On the evening of March 3, 1867, the wind over Morris County carried the smell of rain and something metallic, blood, perhaps, though no one would admit it. Inside a small farmhouse north of Council Grove, Mary and Thomas Lanton awaited their first child. The midwife, a quiet widow named Esther Pike, would later claim that the lightning never ceased that night. The girl was born at exactly 11:47 p.m., just as thunder cracked close enough to rattle the glass. Her first cry was not a wail, but a gasp, shallow, desperate, as though she'd been holding her breath for too long. Esther swore she'd never seen an infant open her eyes so wide. Like she recognized me, the woman would whisper years later. Like she'd been waiting. They named her Clara. The first few weeks passed uneventfully, though the animals on the Lanton farm grew restless. Horses refused the stable nearest the child's window. Dogs whimpered when she cried. Mary thought it was nerves, but Thomas began sleeping with a Bible under the bed. It wasn't until Clara began to speak, earlier than any child her mother had ever heard, that the dread began to settle like dust. At 16 months, she could form sentences. Her first clear words, spoken to her father one dusk, chilled him to the marrow. "You were not there," she said softly, "when I hanged." Thomas dropped the candle in his hand. It went out before it hit the floor. When questioned, Clara could describe things no child could know. Towns that no longer existed after the war, men who'd died by rope or by shot. She mentioned the place with red curtains, the smell of tar, and the name Elias Fenn, a name neither parent recognized. Weeks later, Thomas would find that name again, buried in the county court records from 1859. Elias Fenn, executed for the murder of 3 travelers, hanged by the neck in Fort Riley. His final words, "I'll return before the century dies." And now, 8 years later, their child had spoken them too. That night, the rain came harder than before, slapping against the window like fists. Clara slept peacefully, one hand curled over her chest. In the flicker of lightning, Mary thought she saw a bruise around the girl's throat, thin, circular, and far too deliberate. Cliffhanger. By morning, the bruise was gone, but Clara began calling Thomas by another man's name. By the summer of 1869, the Lanton farmhouse had grown quiet in strange ways. The laughter of a toddler was rare. In its place came questions a child of 2 should never form. "Why do I remember the rope?" she would ask. Or, "Where did they bury the men with no eyes?" Thomas Lanton, once a calm and practical man, began keeping a small journal of his daughter's sayings. The entries were simple, dated carefully, written in a trembling hand. April 4th. She said the name again. Fenn. April 9th. Asked if I still owned the knife. April 17th. She cried when the church bells rang. At first, Mary scolded him for writing such nonsense. But one evening, when Clara sat on the porch steps watching the sunset, she began to hum. The tune was unfamiliar, slow, mournful. When asked where she'd heard it, Clara replied, "They sang it when I was dying." That night, Thomas took the train to Junction City, searching for anything on the name that haunted their home. In a musty courthouse basement, a clerk found the record, Elias Fenn, convicted murderer, executed by hanging on October 2nd, 1859. He'd killed 3 men traveling by stagecoach, 1 with a knife, 2 with a hammer. His last words, as recorded in the Fort Riley Sentinel, were chilling. "You'll see me again. You'll see me small." Thomas rode home in silence, clutching the yellowed paper in his hand. When he reached the farmhouse, Clara was waiting by the door, barefoot in the raw dust. She looked up at him and said, "You went looking for me." He dropped the paper. Mary refused to believe. "It's just talk," she insisted. "Things a child hears." But what child could describe the smell of prison straw, or mimic the sound of boots on gallows steps, or weep when passing the old road to Fort Riley, whispering, "This is where I left them"? By late autumn, the neighbors had begun to notice the strange girl. A shopkeeper in town said she refused to enter his store when she saw a mounted deputy outside. The blacksmith swore she spat on his boot when he mentioned the sheriff's name. "She said I was the one who turned her in," he told Thomas, pale and shaking. "And I wasn't even born then." The next morning, the couple found small handprints in soot on the inside of the parlor mirror, perfectly formed, as though someone had pressed their palms from within. Cliffhanger. That night, Clara whispered a new name in her sleep, one that belonged to a man who was still alive. In the winter of 1870, a letter arrived at the home of Mr. Samuel Holt, a retired railroad inspector living 50 miles east of Topeka. The handwriting was clumsy, uneven, yet deliberate. It read, "You should not have run that night, Sam. You should have hanged with the rest." E.F. Samuel's hand trembled as he read it. E.F. The initials were unmistakable. Elias Fenn. The murderer he had testified against 11 years prior. The man he'd watched swing lifeless from the gallows. Holt burned the letter that evening, but the smell of its smoke stayed in his house for days, like scorched iron. 3 weeks later, another letter arrived, this time written in a delicate, looping script. The same initials, the same message, but with one small addition: "I have found a new tongue." Holt traveled to the sheriff in Manhattan, Kansas, begging for protection. The sheriff laughed it off, blaming pranksters. "Ghosts don't write letters, Sam," he said, "and dead men don't find tongues." But when Samuel returned home, the letters were already waiting on his table, 3 of them, stacked neatly beside his lamp. No one had entered the house. No one had broken the latch. Meanwhile, miles away in the Lanton farmhouse, Clara had fallen ill. She spoke little, but when she did, her voice was different. Low, gravelly, too old for her small frame. She asked her mother to light the pipe, though neither parent smoked. At night, Thomas would wake to see her standing by the window, mouthing words to something he could not see. When he asked what she was saying, she replied, "He's listening through the glass." That same week, word reached them of Holt's death. His neighbor found him collapsed near the fireplace, eyes wide open, hand still clutching a half-written letter addressed to the Fort Riley Sentinel. The final words were barely legible. He said he is coming back in the body of a child named... The ink stopped there, blotted and smeared, as though by a sudden tremor. Thomas rode to Topeka to confirm the story, his mind turning like a windmill in a storm. When he returned, he found Clara sitting on the porch, humming that same haunting tune. She looked up at him and said softly, "He remembers you too." That night the couple heard scratching sounds behind the walls, measured, patient, almost human. Cliffhanger. The next morning, carved into the wood of Clara's bed, were 3 letters, E.F.H. By the time the first thaw came to the plains, in early 1871, the Lanton home no longer felt like a home at all. The faint, rhythmic scratching had grown louder, no longer the idle scurrying of mice, but deliberate patterned strokes, like someone marking the passage of days in the dark. At first, Thomas dismissed it. He spent long nights patching the boards, searching for vermin, or hammering nails to seal the gaps. Yet no matter how much he worked, the sound always returned, sometimes from the attic, sometimes beneath the floorboards, sometimes right behind Clara's bed. Then came the voices. Faint whispers, carried through the cracks of the walls, murmured in a tone both intimate and mocking. Clara began to answer them. She'd sit cross-legged on the floorboards, eyes fixed on the corner, muttering replies too quiet to decipher. When her mother asked who she was talking to, the girl said, "He's in the hollow place. He says you buried him wrong." That night, Thomas pried open a section of the wall with a crowbar. Inside, he found nothing but dust and old timber, until his light caught a small object resting between the beams, a brass button stamped with the insignia of the Union Pacific Railroad. He froze. Elias Fenn had once worked for the same company. Thomas showed the button to his wife, his voice trembling. How could this be here? Clara, standing nearby, smiled faintly. He left it when you stopped him, she whispered. He's angry you told them his name. The air in the room turned thick, almost metallic. That night, Clara's laughter echoed through the house, high and sharp, nothing like the child they'd raised. Thomas entered her room to find her tracing letters into the dust with her fingertip, EFH. What does it mean? He demanded. She turned, her eyes wide and eerily calm. He says the H is for Holt. He finished his work. Thomas stepped back, his breath catching. Holt. Samuel Holt. The man found dead beside his letter. The realization clawed through him like a cold wind. Whoever, or whatever, was speaking through his daughter had already crossed the veil between the living and the dead. The next morning, the scratching stopped. Silence filled the farmhouse. And yet, when the dawn light crept across the floorboards, it revealed a new message carved neatly into the wall above Clara's bed. One left to remember. Cliffhanger. The following night, Clara vanished from her room and her footprints led straight to the abandoned rail yard at the edge of town. The night Clara vanished, the wind came howling through the plains like an uninvited spirit. The snow, crusted and sharp, blew against the shutters with a restless pulse. Thomas Lanton lit his lantern, heart pounding, and followed the small footprints leading away from the farmhouse, each print perfectly outlined in the frost, as if pressed by deliberate, steady steps. The trail wound through the thin forest behind their property, across the frozen creek, and into the outskirts of the old Ravenhill rail yard, a place long abandoned since the war. The depot stood like a mausoleum of timber and rust. The tracks twisted away into the fog, vanishing into the black Kansas horizon. Thomas called her name. No answer. Only the echo, faint, distorted, that seemed to call his name back. Inside the depot, the silence was broken only by the metallic moan of a hanging chain. He lifted the lantern higher, revealing the skeletal remains of tools, crates, and shattered glass. The air smelled of soot and rain-soaked wood. His light flickered across something written in charcoal on the far wall, the same 3 letters Clara had drawn in the dust. EFH. He stepped closer. The boards below his boots groaned. In the far corner, beneath a tattered railway map, lay a heap of discarded debris, and atop it, his daughter's locket. Thomas fell to his knees. "Clara!" he shouted again, voice cracking. A faint sound answered him from below, not a cry, but a dragging noise, rhythmic and patient. He realized then that the rail floor beneath him was hollow. Someone had torn out a section of the planks and covered it again. With trembling hands, Thomas pried the boards loose. The smell that rose up was not of decay, but of old iron and blood. Inside the narrow crawl space lay what looked like the remnants of a body. A half-rotted uniform, the Union Pacific insignia still faintly visible. The skull had been crushed on one side, and one skeletal hand still clutched a length of broken chain. Suddenly a voice, soft, childlike, came from behind him. "He says you remember him now." Thomas turned. Clara stood at the edge of the lantern light, pale and barefoot, her dress torn. Her eyes were wide and glassy, reflecting the flame. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. She smiled faintly. "You were there when he died." The lantern shook in his hand. "Clara, what did you say?" But she had already turned, walking deeper into the shadows between the rails. Cliffhanger. As Thomas followed her, the wind rose sharply, and the iron tracks began to tremble, as though something immense were returning along them from the dark horizon. The sound came first, a slow, metallic groan echoing across the empty fields, the unmistakable rhythm of wheels grinding against forgotten rails. But there were no trains in Ravenhill anymore. The last engine had run its final line through the plains 5 years ago. Thomas froze on the edge of the yard, lantern trembling in his grasp. The wind carried the faint clang of steel and a low, mournful whistle, as though something heavy and ancient were dragging itself out of memory. Clara stood ahead, her small frame silhouetted against the moonlit fog. "Clara, get back here," he shouted. She didn't turn. Her voice floated through the mist, eerily calm. "He's coming. He says you left him there." The rails beneath Thomas's feet vibrated, just enough to send a shiver through the ground. He dropped to one knee, placing his palm on the cold steel. It was warm. In the distance, the fog began to glow faintly red, pulsing with light. For one fractured moment, he thought he saw it. The outline of a train, its headlamp flickering, like a dying star, its smokestack spewing embers into the black. But when he blinked, it was gone. He turned to Clara, but she was no longer standing where she had been. Panic surged through him. He ran along the tracks, calling her name. His lantern swaying wildly, its light dancing over the rusted rails. Then ahead, a figure emerged from the dark. It was a man, tall, shoulders broad beneath a tattered coat, his head bowed low. One hand dragged something behind him, a chain, clinking faintly with each step. The air around him shimmered with heat and the faint scent of iron. Thomas raised the lantern, heart pounding. "Who's there?" The man stopped. The light caught his face, part flesh, part ruin. One side was mangled beyond recognition, the eye socket empty, the skin drawn tight across cracked bone. Thomas stumbled back. He knew that face. He had seen it before, years ago, under the dim light of a campfire, when he and a handful of railroad workers had buried a body they'd sworn never to speak of again. Elias Fenn. The figure tilted its head, lips barely moving. "You left me beneath the earth," it rasped, voice layered with echoes. "Now she carries my name." Before Thomas could speak, the lantern burst in his hand. The yard plunged into darkness. And from somewhere deep in that black expanse, Clara began to hum, a tune her mother once sang her to sleep with, now distorted, hollow, and endless. Cliffhanger. The next morning, the sheriff found Thomas Lanton lying beside the tracks, eyes wide open, his mouth filled with soot, as if he'd tried to scream through fire. Clara was nowhere to be found. 3 days after Thomas Lanton was found dead by the rail yard, the farmhouse stood silent beneath a heavy, breathless sky. Mary Lanton sat by the window, her hands trembling over a cold cup of tea. The sheriff's words still echoed in her ears. "We found him by the tracks. Looked like smoke was coming from his mouth." They never found Clara. Neighbors came and went, whispering condolences and muttered theories. Some said the girl had run away. Others said she'd been taken by wolves. But Mary knew better. She could still feel her daughter's presence in the house. Faint as a heartbeat, steady as breath. On the fourth night, just past midnight, the wind began to stir the curtains. The air carried a smell she hadn't sensed since the day Thomas pried open the rail floor. Hot metal and candle. Soot. From somewhere down the hallway came a sound that stopped her heart. The creak of a door opening. "Clara," she whispered. No answer. The floorboards creaked once more. Then faintly a child's voice, soft, wavering, familiar. "Mother, it's cold." Mary froze. "Clara," she called again, voice cracking. The candle beside her flickered violently, its flame bending toward the doorway. She rose slowly, clutching it, her bare feet silent against the floor. The house was dark except for that single trembling light. When she reached Clara's bedroom, the door was ajar. Inside, the air was colder than outside, so cold her breath came in clouds. On the bed lay Clara's small dress, neatly folded. Beneath it, a handprint, smeared across the quilt in gray soot. Mary's voice broke. "Please, God, no." Then, from behind her, the floor groaned. She turned and saw her reflection in the small vanity mirror across the room. But it wasn't her alone. Standing behind her was Clara, eyes black as coal, her lips parted just enough to whisper, "He says he wants to come home." The mirror cracked. not shattered, just one long, jagged split running straight down the center, dividing mother and child. The candle went out. When morning came, Mary was found asleep on the floor, her hand pressed against the fractured glass, as if trying to hold something inside. She swore she'd dreamed of Clara that night, standing in the cornfield behind the house, whispering to the earth. But when she looked outside the next morning, there were footprints in the dirt, small, bare, and leading toward the barn. Cliffhanger. When Mary followed them, she found Clara's doll hanging from the rafters by a length of chain, its porcelain mouth filled with soil. The Kansas morning was gray and hollow, the kind of silence that feels like it's listening. Mary Lanton stood at the threshold of the barn, staring at the doll swaying gently from the rafters. The chain looped around its porcelain neck was rusted and blackened, and the dirt packed into its tiny mouth had begun to crumble onto the straw floor below. She stepped closer, her breath catching. The doll's glass eyes reflected the dull light seeping through the boards, but behind that reflection, she could swear she saw something moving. When she reached for it, the chain snapped loose and fell, hitting the ground with a dull metallic thud. The weight of it stirred a strange déjà vu deep in her chest. She remembered Thomas returning late one night, his hands caked in mud, his voice shaking when he said, "Some things are better left buried." Now she knew what he meant. Mary lifted the chain. The metal was cold, but beneath the chill, she felt warmth, a pulse, faint and steady. Following instinct more than thought, she began clearing the hay from the barn floor. Beneath it lay a section of warped planks, darker than the rest. She pried one loose with a pitchfork. The smell hit her first, copper and rot, sweet and foul, as if something long dead had been waiting to breathe again. Beneath the boards was a small pit, maybe 4 feet deep. Inside it, the remains of a man's coat, a broken watch, and what looked like the fractured edge of a human jawbone. Mary staggered back, covering her mouth. Her candlelight trembled over the bones, revealing something scratched into the dirt beside them. Letters carved deep by hand. Fen. A sound rose from the pit. Soft at first, like a whisper drawn through wood. Then a low hum began, vibrating through the barn walls, as if the earth itself were remembering. The chain in Mary's hand quivered violently, then stilled, and then a child's laugh. She spun around. Clara stood in the doorway. Her dress was the same as the day she disappeared. The hem torn, the fabric streaked with soot, but her eyes were wrong. Too dark, too knowing. "Mother," she said softly. "He's awake now." Mary stumbled backward toward the pit. "Clara, stay back." But the girl only smiled and stepped closer, her small feet leaving blackened prints in the straw. "You shouldn't have opened it," she whispered. "He said the ground remembers everything." The candle flame went out again, the barn filled with the scent of iron and smoke. Cliffhanger. By dawn, the barn was empty. Only the chain remained, coiled neatly beside the open pit, and Mary's voice could be heard faintly calling her daughter's name across the fields. When the neighbors came looking for Mary Lanton, they found the barn door hanging open, its hinges creaking in the wind. The air was heavy with the smell of rain and something older, the metallic tang of iron that seemed to seep up from the soil. The sheriff, William Crane, ordered a small team to dig where the earth had been disturbed. What they found beneath the barn floor changed the story of Ravensfield forever. There were not one, but 4 graves, each shallow, each bound by a length of the same rusted chain. The remains were brittle, disordered, and buried in haste. 2 adult men, 1 woman, and a child no older than 10. Beside them, half swallowed, by the mud, lay a wooden cross carved with a date, 1862. Crane stood back, uneasy. He knew the year. 1862 was the summer the Union Pacific had first sent crews through the area. The same summer Elias Fenn disappeared. The records listed him as missing after an industrial accident, but no body had ever been recovered. As the men continued to dig, they uncovered another clue, fragments of a blood-stained railroad uniform and a half-melted silver locket engraved with 2 initials, T.L. Thomas Lanton. The truth began to uncoil like smoke. Lanton and Fenn hadn't merely worked together, they'd quarreled violently during the line construction. Witnesses had recalled hearing shouting late one night over missing pay and rumors of sabotage. A fight had broken out near the Ravenhill Junction and both men vanished by morning. Thomas returned weeks later, silent and pale, claiming Fenn had left the state. Now the graves told a different story. As Crane stared into the pit, a shiver passed through the ground, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The loose soil began to tremble. The workers dropped their tools. From somewhere below, a hollow groan rose, deep and human, like air forced through the throat of something not meant to speak. Then, clear as glass, came the sound of a child's voice. "You shouldn't have moved them." The men stumbled back. Crane's lantern fell, shattering on the earth. The flame caught on the spilled oil, illuminating the open graves in a flickering orange light. For a fleeting instant, he swore he saw movement, a pale hand shifting in the dirt, the faint gleam of an eye opening. The fire went out. Silence followed. When they dared to look again, the graves were empty. Only the chain remained, stretched across the soil like something that had crawled away on its own. Cliffhanger. That night, the townsfolk saw lights moving along the abandoned railroad, as though a phantom train were making its way home, sparks flying across the dark prairie. That night, Ravenhill did not sleep. The sky had the color of iron, and the air hummed faintly with static, as if the clouds themselves were charged with old electricity. Those who lived nearest to the rail line swore they could hear it first, the distant churning of wheels against steel, the ghost of a whistle that had not sounded in a decade. By midnight, the entire town gathered along the edge of the tracks, lanterns in hand. Sheriff Crane stood at the front, his jaw clenched tight. "Ain't nothing coming," he told them. But his voice betrayed him. The rails beneath their feet were trembling. The sound grew, a deep, rolling thunder that pulsed through the ground and into their bones. Then, from the horizon, came a glow, red, molten, flickering like a furnace behind smoke. The old railway signal, untouched for years, began to flash. And then they saw it. The night train. No one could explain what it was. A locomotive, half real, half illusion, shimmering in the dark. Its wheels turned without touching the tracks, and its headlamp burned like a dying sun. Through the grime and shadow of the car windows, faces pressed against the glass, pale, expressionless and lit from within. Sheriff Crane stepped forward, his voice breaking the spell. "Stay back!" But the crowd couldn't move. The train was slowing, its ghostly brakes screaming, sparks flying across the gravel. When it came to a stop before them, the door of the first carriage opened with a hiss that smelled of smoke and rust. From the doorway stepped a small figure, a little girl, barefoot, her dress torn and singed at the edges. Clara Lanton. Her mother's locket hung around her neck, gleaming faintly in the red light. Her voice, when she spoke, was not her own. "You buried him wrong," she said, each word deliberate. "You buried all of them wrong." Behind her, the faces in the train car turned toward the townsfolk, Elias Fenn among them, his jaw shattered, his hollow eyes fixed on Crane. The air vibrated as if a storm were about to break. Crane raised his rifle, hands shaking. "In the name of God, what are you?" Clara blinked slowly. "What you made me." The train screamed, a sound that tore through the night. Metal on metal, voice on voice. Lanterns shattered, flames flickered out, and the whole world went dark for an instant that felt like eternity. When the light returned, the train was gone. Only the tracks remained, glowing faintly red, still warm to the touch. Cliffhanger. At dawn, the townsfolk found the sheriff's badge fused to the rails and Clara's locket lying beside it, engraved with a new set of initials that hadn't been there before, E.F.H. When dawn rose over Ravenhill, it revealed a town forever altered. The sky was pale and empty, the kind of silence that lingers after something unspeakable has passed. The rails were still warm, the earth around them scorched black, Sheriff Crane was gone, along with 6 townsmen who had stood nearest the tracks. The rest could only whisper about what they had seen: a train with no steam, faces without breath, and a little girl who called herself by another man's name. By noon, every mirror in town had cracked. The few who dared to speak about the night train agreed on one thing: when it vanished, they had felt something leave with it. A weight, a sickness, maybe the echo of guilt too long buried. But others weren't so sure. They claimed the town itself had become hollow, its fields withered, its livestock refusing to drink from the wells. Mary Lanton's farmhouse stood empty, the doors locked, the windows boarded. When the pastor finally entered to bless the home, he found the words, "Beneath still breathes," carved into the parlor wall. In the attic, tucked beneath Clara's bed, he discovered the locket again, polished clean, shining as if newly made. Inside was a single photograph: Thomas, Mary, Clara. And standing just behind them, half-faded but unmistakable, was Elias Fenn. The photograph was dated August 12, 1867, a full month before Elias Fenn's recorded death. The town tried to forget. They burned the rail yard, sealed the mines, and removed every trace of the old line. But fire doesn't cleanse memory, it only feeds it. And each year, on the anniversary of the train's return, a faint whistle is said to echo across the plains just before midnight. Some say it's only the wind through the hills. Others claim to have seen the glow themselves, moving along where the rails once lay, a red shimmer, followed by the sound of metal links dragging through the dirt. And if you stand near the ruins of the Lanton farmhouse and listen closely, they say you can still hear a child's voice humming through the walls, a song without words. A local historian once tried to document it, wrote it down as the Ballad of the Hollow Rails. He never finished his notes. The last page ended with one sentence written in trembling ink: "The dead do not rest where guilt remains unburied." The rest of the page was soaked in rust-colored stains. If you lived in Ravenhill that night, the narrator's voice lowers to a whisper. Would you have believed the sound was only the wind, or would you have run before the whistle reached your name?